Genesis Part 1. The world begins. In Genesis 1:1, the story begins with a single sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Nothing else is explained yet. The world exists, but it has no shape. In Genesis 1:2, it is described as formless and empty, covered in darkness, with deep waters stretching everywhere. The Spirit of God moves quietly over the surface. Everything feels still, not broken, just unfinished. Then in Genesis 1:3, God speaks for the first time and says, "Let there be light." And light appears immediately, not from the sun or the stars, but simply light itself. For the first time, there's contrast. In Genesis 1:4, light is separated from darkness, and in Genesis 1:5, they are named day and night. Evening passes, morning comes, and time begins to move forward. As the story continues, God speaks again. In Genesis 1:6 through 1:8, the waters separate and the skies form, creating space between what is above and what is below. The world begins to open. Then the waters beneath the sky pull back. In Genesis 1:9, dry ground appears, and in Genesis 1:10, the land and the seas are named. What was once covered is now being revealed. Life begins quietly. In Genesis 1:11, the land produces plants and trees, each of them carrying seeds within itself. Long before people appear, the world is already prepared to sustain life. Time continues to take shape. In Genesis 1:14, light appears in the sky to mark the days, seasons, and years. The sun governs the day, the moon the night, and the stars fill the darkness. They do not rule the world, they simply give it rhythm. That movement fills creation. In Genesis 1:20, the seas swarm with life, and birds fill the sky. In Genesis 1:24, animals walk across the land, and the earth is no longer quiet. Only then does the story begins to slow. In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make mankind in our own image." Human beings are created last. In Genesis 1:27, male and female are made together, both reflecting God's image. They are given responsibility, not ownership, care, not control. When creation is complete, Genesis 1:31 tells us that God looks at everything He made and calls it very good. The story then moves closer. In Genesis 2:7, God forms a human from dust of the ground and breathes life into him. Life is not taken, life is given. A garden is planted in Genesis 2:8, and the human is placed there in Genesis 2:15 to work it and to care for it. Purpose exists before struggle. Then comes a moment that shifts the focus. In Genesis 2:18, God says, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Relationship enters the story. Connection becomes essential. And in Genesis 2:25, the man and woman are described as open and unashamed. The world is whole for now. Genesis Part 2, when choice enters. The story does not stay in the garden. In Genesis 3:1, a voice introduces a question, one that causes the humans to doubt what they were told. The question sounds small, but it carries a lot of weight. In Genesis 3:6, a choice is made. The humans eat from the tree they were told not to eat from. Immediately, something happens and changes. In Genesis 3:7, their eyes are opened, and for the first time, they feel shame. What was once open becomes hidden. And in Genesis 3:8, they hide from God, and fear replaces trust. The relationship between humanity, God, and creation fractures, not destroyed, but altered. In Genesis 3:16 through 3:19, consequences are described. Life becomes harder, work becomes painful, and life outside the garden begins. Yet the story does not end. Humanity continues, and in Genesis 4:1, children are born. Cain and Abel grow, and in Genesis 4:3 through 4:5, they bring offerings to God, and one is accepted, but the other is not. Jealousy takes root quietly, and in Genesis 4:7, Cain is warned that sin is waiting at the door, but he must rule over it. The warning is given, but it is ignored, and in Genesis 4:8, Cain kills his brother. Violence enters the human story. In Genesis 4:9, God asks Cain, "Where is his brother?" Accountability follows, even after the damage is done. Time continues to move forward. In Genesis chapter 5, it lists generations, people born, people living, and people dying. Humanity spreads across the earth, carrying both the image of God and the weight of broken choices. Genesis Part 3: Destruction and Preservation. As generations pass, the story grows darker. In Genesis 6:5, God sees the human wickedness has increased and that people's thoughts are continually turned toward harm, and violence fills the earth. But the story pauses on one name. In Genesis 6:8, we are told that Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. And Noah is instructed in Genesis 6:14 to build an ark, a vessel meant to preserve life. It is not built in secret, and it takes time. And then the flood comes. In Genesis 7:17, the waters rise, covering the earth. Creation begins to reverse itself, and boundaries collapse. What was ordered returns to water, but the story does not end in destruction. In Genesis 8:1, God remembers Noah. The waters begin to recede. And in Genesis 8:11, a dove returns with an olive leaf, showing that life is beginning again. In Genesis 8:21, God promises never again to destroy all living creatures in this way. And in Genesis 9:13, a rainbow appears as a sign of that promise. Humanity begins again. The human nature remains the same. In Genesis 11:4, people gather and say, "Let us make a name for ourselves." They build a city and a tower, seeking control instead of connection. In Genesis 11:7 and 11:8, language is confused, and the people scatter across the earth. The tower is left unfinished. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 end here, not with answers, but with patterns of creation, choice, consequence, preservation, and promise. This is not the end of the story. It is the foundation and the beginning. Thank you for listening. God bless. Amen. And take care.